Let's try the following analogy. Lawful intercept is like suspicious activity reporting in banking. So there are two critical resources needed by criminals and terrorists that require the help of a large corporation: the means of communication and the means of transferring and transporting money. US banks are required by law to keep detailed records on all transactions and to notify the US Department of Treasury whenever they detect any unusual or suspicious transactions. This is done using what's called a suspicious activity report, or an SAR. Now, this careful record keeping and monitoring is expensive, but it does allow law enforcement to find links between suspects and to discover and stop criminal networks. In the same way, phone calls are an excellent source of information about the relationships between people. So, intercepting phone calls between suspected terrorists is necessary if we're going to discover and prevent attacks. Let's now analyze this analogy. So it seems to support the idea that telecommunication companies can be required to monitor phone usage and report certain data about suspicious activity. I mean, this would be consistent with the monitoring and reporting requirements that are placed on financial institutions. So again, reasoning by analogy allows us to apply our solution to an old question, which in this case would be, should banks be forced to report suspicious activity, to a new question: should telecom companies be required to report suspicious activity? So what can we learn about lawful intercept from suspicious activity reporting? Well, if you do some research, you'll find that suspicious activity reporting differs in two very important ways from the current lawful intercept systems. The first difference is that the suspicious activity report is initiated by the bank. The government does not get to continuously monitor what's going on in the bank. So instead, the bank is responsible for deciding what might be considered suspicious behavior, and if it sees suspicious behavior, to report it using the SAR form. Now, the SAR form is pretty simple, which is actually the second major difference. It requires identifying information for those involved in the suspicious activity and a written description of the activity. There is nothing in this that is comparable to completely recording a telephone call. It's just who's involved in what kind of activities, but there's no transcripts of any communication going on here or anything like that. I mean, the list of parties involved would be similar to listing the phone numbers or names of the people, and but listing the amount of the activity and the dates in which it took place would correspond to the times and dates in which phone calls took place, the lengths of calls, and so on. But a financial institution does not include the wealth of data that a phone call does. This is because a financial transaction is not a conversation, so we don't get to know all those extra details. So we see that this analogy does lend some support to the idea that we might require telecom companies to keep careful track of call records. So who calls whom, when, and how long, in order to monitor this information for suspicious patterns and to report suspicious activities to the government or law enforcement. But like the previous analogy, it does seem to contradict the idea that government and law enforcement should be allowed direct or unsupervised access to the data. It just doesn't seem to tell us directly whether or not the telecom companies should be recording and storing the actual contents of the calls. In most cases, just having a convincing analogy is not enough to make sure that we're making the right decision. So even if an analogy appears to fit, there's always a good chance that we're missing something. We're overlooking some morally significant factor in the case that would actually invalidate the analogy. Don't get me wrong, analogies are very useful when it comes to brainstorming. They help us identify the most morally significant factors of a case, and they help us identify potential solutions based on the solutions that were used in these similar problems. Now, with that said, it's always a good idea to double check a solution using other approaches. So what we're going to do here is we'll use the utilitarian approach to check the potential solutions that we've identified by our analogies. And so far, we have three possible solutions available to us. So one solution is to require all VoIP systems to implement lawful intercept, as it is in the current law. Another solution is to do not require VoIP systems to implement lawful intercept or do any other reporting. Law enforcement will have to use physical eavesdropping after getting a warrant. And this was suggested by the first analogy. The third option is to require VoIP providers to monitor and report suspicious activities, but don't build the ability to record conversations into the system. And this was suggested by the second analogy. The first thing we need to do is identify the interested parties and how this decision might affect their happiness. Well, we got quite a few groups of people involved. So we have those that would make or operate the VoIP systems. So this would increase monitoring costs for them. So it's going to cost them money for building this stuff into the system, building monitoring into the system, and also for defending against privacy lawsuits. Now, what about law enforcement officials and employees? Well, the increased monitoring will save them money because they don't have to do as much physical surveillance. This also allows them to catch more lawbreakers, and it should help do their jobs a bit better. Then we have the hackers. Well, built-in lawful intercept does provide them with greater opportunities for stealing and even selling secrets, but it also increases the chance that they're going to get caught. And then we got the non-hacker criminals. So, increased monitoring would increase the likelihood that they'll be caught, or at least that their plots would be disrupted. And then finally, the public. Increased monitoring would mean an increased efficiency for law enforcement, so it would save them tax money, and possibly even increase safety. But it'll also decrease privacy because it makes everyone's phone calls easier to tap. And it could also possibly decrease safety by exposing the public to hacker attacks or to abuse by law enforcement officials. Now that we identified the groups that are at stake, we can perform a utilitarian analysis. And we're going to just start by making an assumption about the happiness of criminals. We just don't care about the happiness of criminals. Because if they're happy, then most likely someone else is not going to be happy. Because if a criminal is happy because they stole something from someone, well, the person that got robbed is not going to be happy. And let's face it, do we really want the bad guys to be happy? No. So we're just going to ignore that part. So we're only going to worry about law enforcement, VoIP creators, providers, and the public. So for law enforcement, solution 1 is the best option. It gives them the most options and the most direct control over monitoring. And it's a pretty low cost compared to the other solutions. So keep in mind, law enforcement officers are public employees. They're tasked with enforcing the laws and keeping people safe. So their change in happiness will most likely reflect the change in happiness of the public as a whole. So in the utilitarian analysis, we can mostly set aside the happiness of law enforcement officers. As long as we ensure that the public is happy, then this should go a long way towards making law enforcement officers happy as well. So if the public's happy, then law enforcement officers are probably going to be happy as well. Now, what about VoIP creators and providers? Well, solution 2 is going to be the best option for them. Because options 1 and 3 are probably about equally as bad. Although solution 1 does require them to modify their system significantly and opens them up to hackers, it requires much less manpower to operate than the third option. But the whole point here is otherwise they would have to spend more work modifying the system if they had to monitor stuff. So if they didn't have to monitor, then they're going to be happy about the fact that they don't have to do all this extra work to get their system the way that the law enforcement wants. Now, what about the public? That's tricky, actually. We're not going to be able to come up with a very clear answer to that, just because every option does have pros and cons for the public. So, like option 1, for example, it may result in the abuses by hackers and officials. So we might get a happiness increase if we're actually catching criminals with the monitoring, but there is a chance that it can get abused if we're not careful. Option 2, it could reduce police effectiveness because of funding. So if we're not doing any monitoring at all, then there could be an issue with actually being able to catch criminals. It could be a serious decrease in the effectiveness of police here. And then option 3, well, it could also reduce the effectiveness just because they might really need the contents of the calls in order to prevent criminal schemes. So what's the final decision here? Well, if we want to do that, we need to make a prediction about how much harm hackers and rogue law enforcement officials might do if we choose the first option and weigh this against the loss of law enforcement capacity caused by the other two options. So that means we're going to need more information before we can come up with this decision. And this is the exact same process that Congress went through when they first tried to draft what was called the Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act, which created the lawful intercept requirement. So, quite honestly, um, we're not going to have a decision here. I mean, making these ethical decisions is difficult. I mean, even when it's done well, even when you go through the thought process, it's still difficult. It takes a lot of time and careful work, just as any important problem does. But we have learned through this, though, about this whole reasoning by analogy. So, I mean, this style of finding similar cases in the past and using them to reason about a new case, it's very fundamental to ethics and to law. So when we saw that this analogy can be used as part of our dialectic to identify possible solutions to the problem. That's the whole point. We use these analogies to help see if we can find solutions that have been used in similar situations and see, can we apply these solutions to our current problem. But we also see that in most cases, an analogy is just not enough to justify an ethical decision. So I mean, once we identify possible solutions through these analogies, we still need to go back and just check to make sure that our choice is the right choice and just use all of our other ethical theories.